Two small figures stumbled through the white fury, their bright pink and gray mittens the only color in an ocean of gray. Sisters, holding hands so tightly their knuckles had gone white beneath the wool. They'd been looking for their cat, now they were looking for a miracle. Miles away, an army veteran and his war dog patrolled the frozen peaks. A man who stopped believing in second chances the day he failed a family in Afghanistan. But when his headlights caught those tiny trembling shapes in the snow, fate whispered a secret. Some missions don't end when the war does. Why were these girls 3 miles from the nearest cabin in a dead zone patrol route? And can a man who believes he's too broken to lead find the strength to carry them home? Before we get deep into the story, please let me know in the comments where you're watching from. Hit subscribe if you're hooked in and ready to enjoy this story, because tomorrow I have another beautiful story to share with you and I don't want you to miss it for anything. Now let's get into the story. Snow drifted through the Blue Ridge Mountains like a shroud, erasing the world in a veil of ice. The wind didn't just howl, it screamed, pressing against the peaks until the mountain roads became frozen ribbons, leading nowhere. Along the ridge crawled a red Ford pickup, its headlights trembling against the whiteout. Inside, Owen Hartley gripped the wheel. At 35, the war had carved deeper lines into his face than age ever could. Dressed in a heavy blue puffer jacket, his jaw was set tight, a habit of a man who spent his life waiting for the next explosion. His eyes, steel gray and distant, were those of a guardian who had seen too much and learned not to expect mercy. In the passenger seat sat Colt, a German shepherd with amber eyes that missed nothing. He was Owen's only tether to the present. Since the mission in Afghanistan that cost a family their lives, Owen had learned to keep moving simply to stay sane. He didn't chase destinations, he chased the silence. Suddenly, Colt's ears pricked. A low rumble started in his chest. "What is it, boy?" Owen whispered. Through the curtain of snow, 2 small shapes staggered. As the truck crept closer, the ghosts took form: Emma, 8, and Sophie, 6. They looked impossibly fragile, their faces raw from the biting wind, huddling together against a world that had turned its back on them. Owen hit the brakes, his heart hammering against his ribs. He saw the same terror in their eyes he'd seen years ago in the desert. He grabbed his flashlight and stepped into the storm, Colt leaping out beside him. "Hey!" Owen shouted over the gale. "You girls okay?" The older girl, Emma, shielded her sister, her voice a thin reed in the wind. "We were looking for Mr. Whiskers. We can't find the way back." Sophie began to wheeze, the telltale whistle of an asthma attack. Her inhaler was miles away. Owen knelt in the snow, meeting them at eye level, his voice shifting from soldier to protector. "Get in the truck," he said, his hand extended like a lifeline. "I've got you. No one survives this mountain alone." The Blue Ridge Mountains didn't just receive snow, they were swallowed by it. Owen Hartley gripped the steering wheel of his red Ford pickup, his knuckles white beneath the leather of his tactical gloves. Outside the cab, the world had ceased to be a place of landmarks and horizons. It was a churning, chaotic void of white, a whiteout that reduced the mighty ancient peaks to mere suggestions of shadow. The wipers rhythmically slapped against the windshield, fighting a losing battle against the wet, heavy sleet that threatened to cement the glass shut. Inside the cabin, the atmosphere was a stark contrast of warmth and weighted silence. The heater hummed at a desperate roar, smelling faintly of scorched dust and old coffee. Beside him, Colt, a 4-year-old German shepherd with a coat the color of burnt umber and midnight, sat perfectly upright. His ears were perpetually forward, his amber eyes scanning the periphery of the headlight beams with a discipline that had been forged in the dust of Kandahar. Colt didn't look at the snow, he looked through it. This was Owen's ritual. Every night the weather turned foul, when the tourists retreated to their log cabin rentals and the local police hunkered down in their stations, Owen drove. He was a ghost on the ridge, a self-appointed guardian of these high, frozen passes. He didn't do it for the thanks. In fact, he went out of his way to avoid them. An hour ago, he had found a college student in a silver sedan spun out into a ditch near mile marker 42. Owen hadn't waited for a handshake or a name. He had simply hooked the winch from his truck to the boy's frame, hauled the car back onto the asphalt with mechanical precision, and checked the tire pressure without saying more than 4 words. "Stay slow. Second gear." Before the boy could even dig out his wallet to offer a tip, Owen was back in his truck, the red taillights disappearing into the mist. He was a man who performed the mechanics of mercy but refused the connection of it. To Owen, help was a debt he was trying to pay off to a universe that kept the ledger firmly in the red. The truck hit a frost heave, and the jolt sent a sharp, familiar ache through Owen's left shoulder, a souvenir from a shrapnel spray 5 years ago. He adjusted his posture, his blue puffer jacket rustling. The movement caused his phone, sitting in the center console, to light up. One new voicemail. Lily, 7:14 p.m. He stared at the screen until it went dark again. He knew what it would say. It would be his daughter Lily, now 9 years old, asking when he was coming down to the Flatlands for a visit. Or perhaps it would be her mother, Sarah, asking why he hadn't sent a card for the school play. He couldn't answer. Every time he heard Lily's voice, he didn't hear the joy of a child. He heard the silence of the ones he'd left behind. He believed, with a conviction that bordered on a sickness, that his brokenness was contagious. If he stayed up here in the thin air and the ice, he couldn't hurt them. He could be a guardian to strangers, but he couldn't be a father to his own. The wind hammered the side of the truck, a sudden gust that nearly shoved the 3-ton vehicle toward the edge of the ravine. Owen corrected the skid with the calm, practiced ease of a man who didn't particularly care if he went over the side, but whose muscles refused to let him fail. "Easy, boy," he murmured, more to himself than the dog. But Colt didn't relax. The dog's low, vibrating growl started deep in his chest, a sound Owen hadn't heard since they were on active duty. It wasn't a growl of aggression, it was an alert. "What is it?" Owen's voice sharpened, the soldier's instincts overriding the man's exhaustion. He peered into the darkness. The headlights were cutting through a particularly thick curtain of snow, illuminating the road in 20-foot increments. For a second, the static of the storm seemed to play tricks on his eyes. Then a flash of color. It was a jarring, unnatural hue against the monochromatic death of the mountain. Pink. A bright, saturated pink that shouldn't exist in a blizzard. Owen's heart, usually a slow, rhythmic thud, skipped a beat. He slowed the truck to a crawl, his eyes squinting until they burned. The shapes were small. Too small to be hikers. Too small to be shadows. 10 yards ahead, the pink resolved into a pair of mittens, attached to a figure that looked like a tiny, bundled doll. Beside it was another figure, slightly taller, wearing a navy blue coat. They were huddled together, standing in the very center of the road as if they had simply run out of the will to move another inch. "God," Owen breathed, his voice cracking. He slammed the truck into park, the tires sliding a few feet on the black ice before the brakes bit deep. Even before the engine had fully died, Colt was whining, his nose pressed against the glass, his tail thumping once against the seat, the signal for target identified. Owen didn't think about his shoulder. He didn't think about his daughter or the voicemail he hadn't returned. He threw the door open, and the mountain air rushed in like a physical blow, 30 below zero wind screaming into the cab. He grabbed his high-lumen tactical flashlight, the beam slicing through the whiteout like a lightsaber. The light hit them directly. 2 little girls. They weren't moving. They were standing hand in hand, their heads bowed against the wind. The snow had already begun to pile up on their shoulders and the brims of their knit caps. They looked like statues of ice, frozen in a moment of pure, unadulterated terror. As Owen stepped out, his boots sinking 6 inches into the fresh powder, the memory he had been running from for 5 years finally caught him. The heat in the Helmand province had been a different kind of monster. It didn't numb you, it cooked you. Owen had been standing at the edge of a landing zone, the dust from the Chinook's rotors creating a blinding, golden fog. The Amati family was 50 yards away. A mother and 2 daughters, 1 6, 1 8. They were running toward the helicopter, their colorful headscarves fluttering like trapped birds. Owen had reached out his hand, screaming for them to move faster. The youngest girl had been wearing a pair of beaded sandals that kept slipping in the sand. Just a little further. Owen had shouted over the roar of the engines. Then the world had turned into a wall of fire. The IED hadn't just taken the road, it had taken the future. Owen had been thrown backward, the air leaving his lungs in a red mist. When he opened his eyes, the colorful scarves were gone. There was only the dust, the ringing in his ears, and the crushing weight of a mission failed. "Sir?" The voice was a tiny, fragile thread, nearly snapped by the wind. Owen blinked, the desert heat vanishing, replaced by the stinging needles of the Blue Ridge blizzard. He was back. He was here. And there were 2 girls in front of him who were still breathing. He moved toward them, his movements slow so as not to scare them. Colt leapt out of the truck, his paws silent in the snow, and immediately circled behind the children, instinctively herding them toward the warmth of the idling engine. "Hey," Owen said, lowering his flashlight so he didn't blind them. He dropped to one knee, the cold seeping through his tactical pants instantly. "Hey, it's okay. I've got you." The older girl, the one in the navy coat, looked up. Her eyelashes were matted with frost, and her skin was the color of blue-tinged marble. She was shaking so violently that her teeth were audible, a rhythmic clicking like a frantic telegraph. She gripped the smaller girl's hand, the one with the pink mittens, and pulled her closer. Are you the rescue?" she whispered. "I am," Owen said, his voice dropping into the low, steady register he used to calm panicked privates. "I'm Owen. And this is Colt. We're going to get you warm, okay?" The smaller girl, who couldn't have been more than 6, didn't speak. Her eyes were glazed, her head lolling slightly to the side. Owen recognized the signs immediately: stage 2 hypothermia. Her body was stopping the shivering because it was running out of fuel. "My sister," the older one gasped, her voice breaking into a sob that didn't even have the strength to carry. "Sophie, she can't, she's sleepy. We were looking for the cat. We got lost." "I know," Owen said, standing up and reaching for them. "I know. But the mission's changed now. Your only job is to get in that truck." He scooped the smaller girl, Sophie, into his arms. She was terrifyingly light, no more than 40 pounds of freezing wool and fading heat. He tucked her against his chest, under the flap of his heavy jacket, trying to share his own body heat. "Come on," he said to the older girl, Emma. "Hold on to my belt. Don't let go." As they struggled back toward the glowing sanctuary of the truck's cabin, Owen felt a strange electric hum beneath his skin. 4 months he had been patrolling these roads, looking for something he couldn't name. A reason to keep waking up, a way to justify the space he took up in the world. He had been looking for a way out of his own head. He never expected that the way out would be through the lives of 2 children who looked exactly like the ones he'd lost. He bundled them into the passenger seat, Colt jumping into the footwell to let the girls have the bench. He turned the heater to its maximum setting, the vents screaming as they blasted hot air into the freezing space. "Get in the truck," he whispered, though they were already inside. He was talking to the memory of the Amati girls, to the ghost that followed him, and to the man he used to be. Owen shut the door, sealing out the storm. The silence of the cab was heavy, broken only by the ragged, wheezing breaths of the children. He looked at the radio, then at the GPS. They were 12 miles from the nearest ranger station, and the road behind them was likely already impassable. The wind was picking up, a high-altitude gale that threatened to turn the mountain into a tomb. Owen gripped the steering wheel, but this time he didn't feel the weight of his guilt. He felt the weight of the girls' lives. "Some missions find you," he muttered, shifting the truck into drive. "Even when you're not looking." He pulled away from the shoulder, the red Ford pickup crawling forward into the white abyss, a lone spark of life in a world of ice. The patrol was over. The rescue had begun. The interior of the red Ford pickup had become a pressurized chamber of survival. Outside, the blizzard had transitioned from a storm into a siege. The wind didn't just buffet the truck. It screamed against the door seals, a high-pitched, ghostly wail that sounded like the mountain itself was mourning. Owen kept the heater on full blast. The air coming from the vents was searing, almost painful against his own wind-burned skin, but it wasn't enough. In the passenger seat, the 2 girls were huddled together in a way that made them look like a single, shivering organism. Emma, the older sister, had her arms wrapped around Sophie, pulling the younger girl into her lap despite the cramped space. "Colt, floor," Owen commanded. The German shepherd obeyed instantly, sliding his large, muscular frame into the footwell. The dog's body heat radiated upward like a furnace. Colt rested his chin on Emma's knee, his amber eyes fixed on Sophie's face. He knew. Dogs always knew when the light was flickering. "How is she?" Owen asked, his voice low, his eyes never leaving the narrow corridor of white illuminated by his headlights. She's making a funny noise," Emma whispered. Her voice was thin, brittle as old parchment. "She sounds like a bird. A tiny bird trapped in a box." Owen reached over, his gloved fingers gently touching Sophie's neck. He didn't need a stethoscope to hear it. Beneath the layers of her sodden navy coat, her chest was hitching in a rhythmic, desperate dance. The sound was a high-pitched, metallic wheeze. Asthma. It wasn't just the cold anymore. The freezing air was constricting her bronchial tubes, sealing her lungs from the inside out. "Does she have an inhaler, Emma? In her pockets? In your bag?" Emma shook her head, a tear finally breaking through the frost on her lashes and carving a hot trail down her cheek. "It's in the cabin. On the nightstand." She didn't think. "We were just looking for the cat." Owen's jaw tightened so hard he felt a molar groan. Okay, we're going to get her help. We're going to get to the ranger station." The ranger station was a relic of the 1970s, an abandoned A-frame structure tucked into a lee of granite 3 miles up the ridge. It wasn't a hospital, but it was shelter. It had a wood stove and a cache of emergency supplies. Most importantly, it had a radio antenna that sat 500 feet higher than the valley floor. He pushed the truck harder. The tires spun on a patch of black ice, the back end fishtailing toward a 500-foot drop into the ravine. Owen didn't breathe. He steered into the skid, his hands light on the wheel, coaxing the 3-ton beast back into alignment. "Stay with me, Sophie," he muttered. "Don't you dare go to sleep." He turned a sharp corner where the road narrowed, hemmed in by ancient hemlocks that leaned over the asphalt like weary giants. Suddenly, his headlights hit a solid wall. Owen slammed on the brakes. The truck slid, groaning, before coming to a dead stop 3 feet from the obstacle. It wasn't a snowdrift. A massive hemlock, its trunk 3 feet thick and laden with hundreds of pounds of ice, had snapped under the weight. It lay across the road, its shattered branches tangled with a secondary fall of granite and scree. It wasn't just a blockage, it was a barricade. "No," Emma gasped, her eyes widening as she stared at the wall of wood and ice. "We're trapped." Owen stared at the tree. In his mind, the image shifted. He wasn't in North Carolina anymore. He was back on a narrow goat path in the Hindu Kush, staring at a rock slide that had cut off the evacuation route for the Ahmadi family. He could see the dust rising, could hear the distant rhythmic thud-thud-thud of the rescue helicopter that would never arrive for them. The mission doesn't end when the war does. The words he'd thought earlier returned to him like a curse. "Owen?" Emma's voice snapped him back. He looked at Sophie. Her lips were no longer blue-tinged, they were turning a terrifying shade of slate gray. Her breaths were coming in short, shallow gasps that barely moved the fabric of her coat. "We can't go back," Owen said, his voice taking on the clipped, surgical tone of a commanding officer. "The road behind us is a sheet of ice, and the wind is too high to turn the truck around without sliding off the ridge." "What do we do?" Emma asked, her voice rising toward panic. Owen looked at his GPS. The ranger station was less than a mile away as the crow flies, just over the next rise. But between them and the station lay a steep incline of virgin snow and a wind chill factor that could stop a heart in minutes. "We walk," Owen said. "But Sophie, she can't walk." "I know," Owen said. He was already moving, reaching into the back of the cab for his emergency pack. He pulled out a heavy wool blanket and a roll of duct tape. "I'm going to carry her." He stepped out into the storm. The wind nearly ripped the door from his hand. It was a physical weight, a wall of cold that felt like being submerged in liquid nitrogen. He worked with a frantic, methodical speed. He wrapped Sophie in the wool blanket, then used the duct tape to secure the bundle, creating a makeshift papoose. He opened his own blue puffer jacket and tucked the small, shivering bundle against his chest. He zipped the jacket as high as it would go, using his own body heat as a living incubator for the girl. "Emma, listen to me," he shouted over the roar of the wind. He grabbed her hand, his glove crushing her smaller one. "You are going to hold on to my belt. You are going to step exactly where I step. Do you understand?" Emma nodded, her face pale and determined. She was 8 years old, but in that moment she looked a century old. Colt. Lead. The German shepherd leapt from the truck, his paws disappearing into the knee-deep snow. He didn't hesitate. He began to plow a path, his powerful hindquarters driving him through the drifts. They left the warmth of the truck behind. The first 100 yards were a nightmare. Every step was a battle against gravity and the elements. Owen carried 40 pounds of child against his chest and another 30 pounds of gear on his back. The snow was uneven, hiding rocks and fallen branches that threatened to snap an ankle with every stride. Behind him he could feel Emma tugging on his belt. She stumbled once, a small cry lost to the gale, but Owen didn't stop. He couldn't. If they stopped moving, the cold would settle into their bones and begin the process of shutting them down. 1 step. 2 steps. Breathe. His lungs burned. The air was so cold it felt like inhaling ground glass. He looked down at the gap in his jacket. Sophie's eyes were closed, her head resting against his sternum. He could feel the frantic, fluttering beat of her heart, like a bird with a broken wing. "Keep going, Colt," he gasped. The dog looked back, his muzzle covered in frost, his eyes glowing with an almost supernatural intensity. He barked once, a sharp, rallying cry, and pushed deeper into the white. They began the ascent. The incline was 40 degrees, a slick slope of ice-crusted snow. Owen dug his boots in, his calves screaming. He used his free hand to grab at frozen laurel bushes, pulling himself and Emma upward. Halfway up the slope, a sudden gust of wind, a mountain scream, hit them with the force of a freight train. It knocked Emma off her feet. She slid backward, her hands slipping from Owen's belt. "Emma?" Owen dropped to his knees, anchoring himself with his elbows to keep from crushing Sophie. He reached back, his fingers clawing at the air. Emma was sliding toward the edge of the ravine, her navy coat a dark blur against the white. Colt moved like a streak of lightning. He didn't wait for a command. The dog lunged down the slope, his teeth snagging the hood of Emma's coat. He dug his claws into the ice, his muscles bunching as he acted as a living anchor. Emma stopped inches from the drop. For a heartbeat, the world went silent, save for the thundering of Owen's heart. He scrambled down, grabbing Emma's arm and hauling her back to the center of the path. He didn't say a word. He simply pulled her into a brief, crushing hug, then set her back behind him. "Don't let go," he rasped. "Never let go." They reached the crest of the ridge. Through the swirling chaos, a dark shape appeared. It was the A-frame. It looked like a jagged tooth rising out of the snow, its windows boarded up and its porch buried in drifts. "There!" Emma cried, her voice regained. They stumbled the last 50 yards. Owen didn't look for a key. He reached the heavy oak door and hit it with his shoulder once, twice, 3 times. The old wood groaned, the deadbolt screaming as it was sheared from the frame. They fell inside. The silence of the interior was deafening. The air was still freezing, but the wind was gone. The only sound was the heavy, rhythmic thudding of Owen's boots on the floorboards and the frantic panting of the dog. Owen didn't waste a second. He laid Sophie down on a dusty wooden table in the center of the room. He stripped off his jacket, his own breath coming in ragged plumes. "Emma, find the wood stove. There should be a box of kindling next to it. Go." As Emma scrambled to the corner of the room, Owen unbundled Sophie. She was limp. Her face was the color of wood ash. He put his ear to her chest. The wheeze was louder now. It was a wet, rattling sound. "She's not getting enough air," he whispered. He looked around the room, his tactical mind scanning for assets. A rusted stove. A stack of old National Geographics. A first aid kit that looked like it hadn't been opened since the Reagan administration. Then he saw it. In the corner of the kitchen area, a small propane camping stove. "Emma, get that stove over here. And find a pot. There's a rain barrel outside the back door. Break the ice and get me 2 inches of water. Now." He began to strip Sophie out of her wet clothes, wrapping her in a dry, albeit dusty horse blanket he found in a locker. Colt sat by her head, licking her hand, his tail low and wagging with a desperate rhythmic thrum. Emma returned with the water. Owen lit the propane stove, the blue flame casting long, dancing shadows against the peeling wallpaper. As the water began to simmer, a thick cloud of steam rose into the air. He lifted Sophie up, holding her over the pot, creating a tent with the wool blanket. "Breathe, Sophie. Breathe the steam." For a long minute nothing happened. The only sound was the hiss of the stove and Emma's quiet sobbing. Then a cough. It was a deep, racking sound that shook Sophie's entire frame. She coughed again, then took a long, shuddering breath. The metallic whistle in her chest softened, just a fraction. "That's it," Owen whispered, his forehead pressed against the girl's cold temple. "That's it, little soldier. You fight for it." He looked up at the window. The storm was still raging, a white monster clawing at the glass. He knew they weren't safe yet. The fire wasn't lit, the radio hadn't been checked, and the parents were still out there in the dark, thinking their children were dead. But as Sophie's eyes fluttered open, 2 slivers of bright, terrified blue, Owen felt a weight lift from his soul that he hadn't even realized he was carrying. He had reached them. He had held them. And this time the world hadn't turned to fire. "Emma," Owen said, looking at the older girl who was watching him with wide, reverent eyes. "Help me get that fire started. We've got a long night ahead of us." Outside, the wind howled in frustration, but inside the cabin, the first spark of a match caught the kindling. A small orange glow began to grow, reflected in the amber eyes of a dog and the steel-gray eyes of a man who had finally stopped running. The interior of the Blue Ridge Ranger Station was a tomb of cedar and dust, preserved in a layer of frost that had crept through the floorboards over years of abandonment. When the heavy door finally slammed shut, the screaming of the wind didn't disappear. It merely muffled into a low, predatory growl, like a beast pacing outside a cage. Owen Hartley didn't pause to appreciate the silence. Every second he spent in the dark was a second the cold was winning. "Emma, stay right there. Don't move," he commanded, his voice echoing off the vaulted A-frame ceiling. He moved with the mechanical fluidity of a man who had lived through 1,000 worst-case scenarios. His tactical flashlight, held between his teeth, cast a frantic, bouncing beam of light across the room. He found the wood stove, a heavy, rusted iron beast sitting on a stone hearth. Beside it, as if waiting for this exact moment of desperation, sat a bin of seasoned hemlock and old newspapers. His fingers, stiff and numb, fumbled with a waterproof match case. The first match snapped. The second hissed and died. On the third, a flare of sulfur and phosphorus illuminated the hollows of his face. He touched the flame to the corner of a 1984 edition of Outdoor Life. The paper curled, blackened, and then, blessedly, bloomed into a small, flickering orange flower. "Feed it, Emma," Owen said, his voice raspy. "One stick at a time. Small ones first." As the girl huddled by the hearth, Owen turned his attention to the table. He had laid Sophie there, still wrapped in his puffer jacket. He reached into his pack and pulled out 2 Mylar emergency blankets. The silver foil crinkled with a sound like breaking glass as he unfolded them. He stripped the girls out of their sodden outer layers. Their clothes were heavy with ice, stiff as cardboard. Underneath, their sweaters were damp with sweat and melted snow, a lethal combination in this temperature. He wrapped them together in a single Mylar cocoon, the reflective silver material designed to bounce their own fading body heat back toward their cores. "It's cold, Owen," Sophie whimpered. It was the first time she'd spoken clearly since he'd found them. Her voice was a ghostly vibration, barely audible over the crackle of the growing fire. "I know, Sophie. I know. But we're winning now," Owen said. He took 2 old metal canteens from his pack and filled them with the water he'd melted on the propane stove. He wrapped them in spare wool socks and tucked them into the Mylar blanket near the girl's feet and armpits, the primary heat exchange points. Colt, sensing the shift in the room's energy, stepped toward the table. The German shepherd didn't ask for permission. He hopped onto the wide wooden bench and pressed his long, muscular body against the outside of the silver blanket. "He's helping," Emma whispered, her eyes wide as she watched the dog. "He's a radiator," Owen said, a ghost of a smile touching his lips. "He's got a heart like a furnace. He'll keep the heat from escaping." But as the room began to warm, the air itself became the enemy. The transition from the biting, frozen wind to the dry, dusty heat of the cabin triggered the very thing Owen had been fearing. Sophie began to cough. It wasn't a normal cough. It was a tight, constricted sound, the sound of an airway closing. Her small chest began to heave, her ribs visible beneath her thin undershirt as she fought to pull oxygen into lungs that were slamming shut. "Emma," Owen said, his tone sharpening. "The inhaler. You're sure it's not in her pocket?" We left it at the cabin," Emma cried, her hands shaking as she fed another log into the stove. "She said she was fine. She said the cat was just in the bushes. We weren't supposed to be gone long." Owen knelt by the table, his heart hammering a frantic rhythm against his ribs. He had a trauma kit in the truck, but the truck was a mile away, buried behind a wall of hemlock. In his current pack he had bandages, antiseptic, and morphine, none of which would help a 6-year-old girl whose lungs were failing. He remembered his training. Environment. Airway. Circulation. "Sophie, look at me. Look at my eyes," he said. He took her tiny, trembling hands in his. "I want you to breathe with me. Slow. Like you're blowing out a candle. Don't fight it. Just blow the candle out." He modeled the breath, his own chest expanding and contracting. Sophie tried to follow, her blue eyes fixed on his with a terrifying, absolute trust. The wheeze was a high-pitched whistle now, a sound that tore at Owen's soul. It reminded him of the static on a radio, the sound of a signal being lost. "Is she going to die?" Emma asked. The question was flat, devoid of the drama of a child's tantrum. It was the question of a girl who had seen the abyss and was waiting for it to blink. "No," Owen said, the word a vow. "Not tonight. Not on my watch." He reached for the propane stove again. He moved the pot of steaming water closer to Sophie's head, creating a small steam tent with his own spare shirt. "The moisture will help, Sophie. Just keep breathing the mist." To distract Emma, and perhaps to distract himself from the crushing weight of the responsibility, Owen began to move around the room, securing the perimeter. He checked the boarded-up windows, kicking aside old animal droppings and rotting pine needles. Emma watched him, her back to the fire. "What's your dog's name?" she asked suddenly. "Colt," Owen replied. "Colt," she repeated, testing the weight of it. "Was he a soldier too? Like you?" Owen paused, his hand resting on a rusted filing cabinet. The word soldier felt like a stone in his throat. He looked at Colt, who was currently acting as a living pillow for a gasping child. He thought of the dusty streets of Sanjin, the smell of cordite, and the way Colt had once alerted him to a pressure plate hidden under a discarded soda crate. "Yeah," Owen said softly. "He was a soldier. He was better at it than I was." Did he save people? He did. He saved me. More times than I can count. Is that why you're here? Emma asked, her voice innocent but sharp. To save us? Because you're a soldier? Owen didn't answer. He couldn't. How could he explain to an 8-year-old that he wasn't here because he was a hero? He was here because he was a man trying to outrun a shadow. He was here because he was a failure who had been given a second chance he didn't think he deserved. He turned away, his eyes landing on a heavy olive-drab box sitting on a built-in desk in the corner of the room. It was an old Motorola base station, the kind the Forest Service used before satellite phones and cellular repeaters became the norm. He lunged for it, his boots thudding on the floorboards. He flicked the power switch. Nothing. Come on, he hissed. He checked the lead-acid battery attached to the back. It was covered in a white crust of corrosion. He grabbed a multi-tool from his belt and began to scrape at the terminals, his movements frantic. He reconnected the wires, his fingers stinging from the acid. He flicked the switch again. The dial glowed a faint, sickly amber. A burst of white noise exploded into the room, a beautiful, chaotic hiss. Static. He grabbed the heavy plastic microphone, his thumb hovering over the push-to-talk button. He began to cycle through the frequencies, his ears straining for a human voice in the ocean of noise. Copy? Any unit, on the ridge. The voice was faint, buried under layers of atmospheric interference and the roar of the storm. Owen adjusted the squelch dial, his breath held. This is Search and Rescue Base. North. Repeat. We have a confirmed missing persons report. The Collins family, vacationing at Blue Ridge Cabin 14. Reporting 2 daughters missing. Emma Collins, age 8. Sophie Collins, age 6. Last seen near the trailhead at 3:30 p.m. Weather conditions are non-survivable. All units be advised, ground search is suspended until first light. The words hit Owen like a physical blow. Collins. He had names for them now. They weren't just the girls or the mission. They were Emma and Sophie Collins. Somewhere down the mountain, in a lodge or a police station, there were parents who were currently being told that their children were likely already dead. They were being told that the search was suspended. They were being told to wait for the morning to find the bodies. Owen's blood ran cold. He pressed the microphone button, his knuckles white. Base, this is Owen Hartley. Do you copy? I have the Collins girls. Repeat, I have Emma and Sophie Collins. We are at the Mile 52 Ranger Station. They are alive. Do you copy? He released the button. The static roared back, indifferent. Base, this is Hartley. Come in. Sophie is having a medical emergency. Acute asthma attack. We need an extraction or a medical drop. Does anyone copy? He waited. 10 seconds. 20. The radio crackled again, but it wasn't a response. It was the same loop, the voice of the dispatcher sounding tired, defeated. Search suspended. God help them. Owen slammed the microphone onto the desk. The antenna on the roof was likely buried in ice, or the cable had been severed by a falling branch. He could hear them, but they couldn't hear him. He was a ghost talking to the living. He looked back at the table. Sophie's breathing hadn't improved. The steam was helping, but it was a temporary fix. Her body was tiring. The work of breathing was a massive caloric drain, and her small heart was racing to keep up. Owen? Emma asked. She had moved away from the fire, her eyes fixed on the radio. Did they hear you? Are they coming for us? Owen looked at the radio, then at the storm-lashed window, then at the girl who was looking to him for the truth. In Afghanistan, he had lied to the Ahmadi family. He had told them the helicopter was coming. He had told them they were safe. He had watched that lie burn in the desert sun. He wouldn't lie to Emma Collins. They didn't hear us, Emma, he said, his voice steady but heavy. The radio is broken. They think we're still out there in the snow. Emma's lip trembled. So, no one is coming? Owen walked over to her. He knelt down, ignoring the ache in his knee, and placed a hand on her shoulder. No one is coming yet. But look at this room. We have a fire. We have a roof. We have cold. He looked at Sophie, whose head was still tucked under the steam tent. Finding you was the easy part, Emma, Owen said, and for the first time, he realized he was talking to himself as much as the child. I thought my job was just to find the lost. But I was wrong. The mission isn't over until you're home. He stood up, his gaze sweeping the room again. He wasn't looking for a way to call for help anymore. He was looking for weapons. He needed more heat. He needed better medicine. He needed a way to keep a 6-year-old's lungs open for another 8 hours. We're going to survive the night, Owen said, his voice echoing the steel gray of his eyes. And in the morning we're going to walk out of here. All of us. Theme: finding them is only the beginning, keeping them alive is everything. Owen Hartley, the man who had spent years trying to disappear, had never been more visible. He was the only thing standing between two children and the white silence of the mountain. He reached into the filing cabinet searching for anything: a bottle of old brandy, a forgotten first aid kit, a miracle. "Emma," he said without looking back, "tell me about your cat. Tell me everything about Mr. Whiskers. Keep talking. Don't stop." He needed the sound of a human voice. He needed to remember what he was fighting for. As Emma began to talk about a tabby cat with a crooked tail, Owen found a dusty, unopened box of emergency flares and a half-full bottle of isopropyl alcohol. It wasn't a miracle, but it was a start. The night was just beginning and the mountain was still hungry. But Owen Hartley had finally found a mission he refused to fail. The night didn't just fall, it descended like a heavy, suffocating shroud. Outside the ranger station, the Blue Ridge Mountains had vanished, replaced by a screaming white purgatory where the wind achieved a pitch that sounded like human voices crying out in the dark. Inside, the world had shrunk to a 6-foot radius of flickering orange light cast by the wood stove. Owen Hartley sat on the floor, his back against the stone hearth, his legs stretched out toward the girls. He was a man of shadows now, the firelight carving deep, jagged valleys into the lines of his face. He kept his eyes on Sophie. The steam tent had helped, but the air in the cabin was getting thin, and the girl's breathing had settled into a rhythmic, terrifying struggle. "Keep her talking, Colt," Owen whispered, though the dog was already doing his part. Colt lay stretched out like a tawny bridge between the two girls. His head was resting on Sophie's lap, his tail occasionally thumping the floorboards with a dull thud-thud-thud that served as a primitive metronome for their survival. Emma sat huddled in her silver mylar blanket, looking like a discarded star that had fallen into the dust. Her shivering had stopped, replaced by a wide-eyed, hypervigilant exhaustion. She watched Owen with the unwavering intensity that only a child can muster, a gaze that stripped away rank, history, and armor. "Are you a daddy?" The question hit Owen with more force than the hemlock tree that had blocked the road. He felt the air leave his lungs, his throat tightening as if the cold had finally found a way inside. He looked at the fire, watching a knot of pine explode into a shower of sparks. "Why do you ask that, Emma?" he countered, his voice sounding like gravel being ground together. "Because of how you hold Sophie," she said simply. "And because you have a dog. Daddies always have dogs in the movies. And because you look sad. Like my teacher did when her husband went away." Owen cleared his throat, the sound harsh in the small room. He looked at Colt, who was watching him with a knowing amber glint. "I have a daughter," Owen said, the words feeling like a confession. "Her name is Lily. She's 9. Just a little older than you. Does she live in the mountains too?" Emma asked, leaning forward, the silver blanket crinkling. "No. She lives down in the valley. With her mom." "Why don't you live with her?" Owen didn't answer immediately. He reached out and adjusted a log with a rusted poker, the iron clanking against the grate. How could he tell her that he lived up here because he was afraid that if he got too close to his daughter, she'd see the ghost that followed him? How could he explain that he believed his own heart was a minefield, and he was staying away to keep her from stepping on the wrong part of him? "It's complicated, Emma. Sometimes grown-ups, they get broken. Like a toy that doesn't work right anymore. I thought if I stayed up here, I wouldn't break anything else." "But you're a soldier," Emma said, her voice filled with a child's unshakable logic. "Soldiers fix things. They protect people." "Is that what you think?" Owen asked, a ghost of a bitter smile on his lips. "Tell us about him," Sophie whispered from beneath her blanket, her voice a fragile rasp. She reached out a small, pale hand and buried her fingers in Colt's thick fur. "Tell us about the soldier dog." Owen looked at his partner. Colt's ears twitched at the mention of his status. "Colt wasn't born in the mountains," Owen began, his voice softening as he retreated into a story he actually knew how to tell. "He was born in a place with a lot of sand and a lot of heat. He went to a special school where they taught him to see things that people can't see. He can smell fear and he can smell things hidden deep under the ground." "Was he in the war with you?" Emma asked. "He was. We were a team. We'd walk down roads where no one else wanted to go. Colt would walk in front of me, and if he sat down, I knew there was danger. He never once got it wrong. Not once. He saved my life more times than I can count on both hands." "Is he a hero?" Sophie wheezed. "The best kind," Owen said. "He doesn't do it for medals. He does it because he loves his pack. To Colt, anyone he's protecting is part of his pack. That means you two are his pack now." He won't let anything happen to you." The girls looked at the dog with a new sense of awe. Colt, for his part, simply let out a long, contented sigh, his breath warm against Sophie's hand. The room fell into a brief, heavy silence, broken only by the howl of the wind outside. The mountain scream was getting louder, the pressure of the storm causing the old timbers of the ranger station to groan and pop. "Mommy always tells us a story before bed," Sophie whispered. "About the princess and the cat. Can you tell us a story, Owen? A real one?" Owen closed his eyes. The embers in the stove were a deep, pulsing red. They looked like the sunset over the Helmand province. They looked like the fire that had consumed his soul 5 years ago. "I'll tell you about Lily," he said, the words surprising even him. "She loves the woods," he began, his voice thickening with a memory he usually kept locked in a lead box. "When she was 5, before I went away for the last time, we went hiking near a waterfall. She found a turtle that had gotten stuck in some old fishing line. She didn't scream and she didn't run away. She just sat there, patient as a mountain, and helped me cut the line. When the turtle crawled back into the water, she looked at me and said, 'Dad, we're the protectors, right?'" Owen paused, the memory of his daughter's face, so full of light and unearned pride in him, feeling like a knife in his ribs. "I told her yes. I told her we were. But then I went back overseas. And I saw things. I saw a family, Emma. A family just like yours. A mother and 2 sisters. They were running for a helicopter, trying to get to safety." His voice trailed off. He could see them. He could see the Amati girls, their colorful scarves fluttering in the desert wind. He could see the flash. He could feel the heat. He could hear the silence that followed the explosion, a silence so loud it had stayed in his ears for 5 years. "What happened?" Emma asked softly. "I couldn't get to them," Owen whispered, his eyes fixed on a point far beyond the cabin walls. "The road was blocked. The fire was too much. I stood there and watched them vanish. And I decided right then that a protector who can't protect isn't worth anything at all." "But you found us," Sophie said. She had pulled herself up slightly, her small, pale face emerging from the silver blanket. Her eyes were bright, far too bright, fueled by the fever of her struggling lungs. "You found us in the dark, Owen. And you brought us here. And Colt didn't let Emma fall off the mountain. Maybe you're not broken. Maybe you're just tired." Owen looked at the 6-year-old girl. Her wisdom was accidental and devastating. It was the kind of honesty that adults spent their entire lives trying to avoid. "Maybe," Owen said, though he didn't believe it. He stood up, his joints popping. He checked the fire, adding the last of the heavy hemlock logs. He knew the temperature outside was dropping into the negatives now. The thermal bridge of the cabin was failing. He could see frost forming on the inside of the door frame. He walked back to the radio, flicking the switch again. The static was a roar of white noise, an angry sea that refused to carry a message. "Search suspended, non-survivable." The words of the dispatcher echoed in his mind. He looked at his watch. It was 3 a.m. The witching hour of the mountain. This was when the cold was at its most aggressive, and when the human body was at its weakest. He turned back to the table and his heart skipped a beat. Sophie wasn't wheezing anymore. For a terrifying second, Owen thought she had stopped breathing altogether. He lunged across the room, his boots skidding on the floor. "Sophie." He reached her just as she let out a long, shuddering gasp. It wasn't a breath, it was a struggle. Her airway was so constricted that the steam was no longer enough. Her chest was retracting, the skin pulling tight around her collarbone and ribs as she fought for every molecule of oxygen. "Emma, get more water," Owen shouted. "The pot is empty," Emma cried, her voice rising in panic as she looked at the dry propane stove. "Then get snow. Fill the pot with snow. Move." As Emma ran for the back door, Owen scooped Sophie into his arms. She was limp, her head falling back against his shoulder. Her skin was clammy, the cold sweat of respiratory failure. "Stay with me, Sophie. Listen to my voice. Fight for it. You're a soldier dog now, remember? You're part of the pack." He sat back down by the fire, holding her upright to try and ease the pressure on her lungs. Colt moved closer, his whine a high-pitched, mournful sound that mirrored the wind outside. "I've got you," Owen whispered, rocking her gently. "I've got you. I'm not going to let go. I'm never going to let go." In the flickering light of the dying embers, Owen Hartley looked like a man possessed. He wasn't thinking about Afghanistan anymore. He wasn't thinking about the Amati family or the medals he'd thrown in the trash. He was thinking about Lily. He was thinking about how he had spent 5 years hiding from his daughter because he was afraid of failing her. And he realized, with a clarity that cut through the darkness, that the only way to save himself was to save these girls. He looked at the radio, then at the flares on the desk. He knew what he had to do. The ranger station wasn't a sanctuary anymore. It was a trap. If he stayed here, Sophie would be dead by dawn. "Emma," he shouted as she returned with a pot full of gray, slushy snow. "Forget the water. Pack your things. We're not waiting for the morning." "But the storm," Emma gasped, her eyes wide with terror. "The storm isn't going to kill us," Owen said, his voice ringing with a conviction he hadn't felt in years. "Not being brave enough to leave is what kills people. We're going to walk out. Now." He looked at Colt. The dog stood up, his ears pricked, his entire body tensed for movement. "Lead, Colt," Owen commanded. The night was at its darkest and the mountain was at its most lethal. But as Owen Hartley bundled the dying girl into his jacket and grabbed his gear, he felt a strange, cold peace. He had stopped running from who he used to be. He was a protector again. And he had a mission to finish. Theme: children demand honesty, adults avoid. Sophie's trust had stripped away Owen's excuses. He couldn't hide in the shadows of his past anymore. He had to be the man they thought he was or die trying. The air in the ranger station had grown thick with the scent of wet wool, burning hemlock, and the metallic tang of fear. The small fire Owen had built was a valiant but failing soldier against the overwhelming army of the cold pressing against the cedar walls. But it wasn't the temperature that was killing them now. It was the silence. Inside the makeshift steam tent, the sound of Sophie's breathing had changed. The high-pitched, metallic whistle, the sound of air fighting its way through a narrowing straw, had stopped. To an untrained ear, it might have sounded like improvement. To Owen Hartley, a man who had seen men bleed out in the dust and gasping for their last breaths in the back of a rattling medevac, it was the sound of a closing door. "Silent chest," Owen whispered, the words barely a vibration in the air. He didn't need a stethoscope to know that Sophie's lungs were no longer moving enough air to even create a wheeze. Her body was exhausted. The frantic, rhythmic pumping of her chest had slowed to a shallow, desperate hitch. Her small face, illuminated by the dying orange glow of the stove, was a terrifying shade of porcelain gray, her lips deepened to a bruised purple. "Owen?" Emma's voice was a small, fragile thing, trembling like a leaf in the gale. "She's not making the noise anymore. Is she better?" Owen didn't look up. He was busy checking Sophie's capillary refill, pressing her tiny thumb and watching the color return, or fail to return. It was too slow. Her oxygen levels were plummeting. "She's tired, Emma," Owen said, his voice a forced anchor of stability. "She's very tired. We need to give her a reason to keep fighting." He reached into his pack, his hands moving with a frantic, surgical precision. He had a standard-issue military first aid kit. It was designed for shrapnel, for gunshot wounds, for the sudden and violent traumas of war. It was not designed for a 6-year-old girl having a catastrophic status asthmaticus event. He looked at the morphine. Useless, it would suppress her breathing further. He looked at the bandages and the tourniquets. None of it could open her lungs. Suddenly, the radio on the desk erupted into life. It wasn't the clean, professional tone of the dispatcher this time. It was a jagged, raw sound, a woman's voice shredded by cold and terror. "Copy? Please, if anyone is listening, my babies." The transmission was a ghost of a sound, oscillating through the white noise of the blizzard. Owen lunged for the desk, his boots skidding on the grit-covered floorboards. "This is Rachel Collins." The voice shrieked through the static, then dipped into a sob. "We're at the lower trailhead. The search teams say they can't go up. The avalanche. They say nobody could survive out there. But they're my babies. Emma. Sophie. If you can hear me, stay where you are. Please God, stay where you are." The radio crackled into a deafening roar of static, then went silent. The battery was dying, the lead acid cells finally succumbing to the sub-zero temperatures. "That was Mommy," Emma whispered. She had crawled across the floor and was clutching the edge of the desk, her knuckles white. "She thinks we're dead. Owen, tell her. Tell her we're here." Owen grabbed the microphone, his thumb jamming the button down. "Base. Rachel. This is Owen Hartley. I have them. I am at the Mile 52 station. Sophie is in respiratory arrest. I need an ambulance at the lower checkpoint. I am bringing them down." He released the button. The silence that followed was absolute. He waited, his heart thundering against his ribs, watching the amber light of the radio fade to a dull, dying yellow. "Base, do you copy? I am coming down the alternate route. The East Ridge. Do you copy?" Nothing. The radio was a paperweight. The parents were less than 3 miles away as the crow flies, but in this storm they might as well have been on the moon. Owen turned back to the table. Sophie's eyes were open now, but they were unfocused, rolling back toward the ceiling. Her hand, which had been clutching Colt's fur, went limp, sliding onto the wooden boards with a dull, final thud. The impossible choice stood before him, sharp and cold as a bayonet. If he stayed, Sophie would be dead within the hour. The steam wasn't enough, the fire was dying, and the silent chest was the final stage before the heart simply stopped from the strain. If he stayed, he would be a witness to the very thing he had spent 5 years trying to forget, the death of the innocent while he stood by, helpless. But if he left? The storm was a Category 4 blizzard. The main road was buried under an avalanche. The alternate route he had mentioned was a steep, treacherous descent through an unstable snowpack that hadn't seen a traveler in years. He would be carrying a dying child on his back, leading an exhausted 8-year-old by the hand, through a darkness so thick you couldn't see your own boots. He looked at Emma. She was looking at him with a terrifying, absolute faith. To her, he wasn't a broken veteran hiding from a failed mission. He was the man with the dog. He was the soldier. He was the one who had promised they wouldn't die. Emma, Owen said, his voice dropping into the low, steady vibration of a commander briefing his squad before a high-stakes insertion. Look at me. She looked. Her face was smudged with soot and tears, but she squared her shoulders. We have to leave. Right now. But Mommy said stay where we are, Emma argued, her voice trembling. She said the searchers can't come up. The searchers can't come up, Emma? But we can go down. Your sister needs a doctor. She needs the medicine in that ambulance. If we stay here, we won't make it to the morning. Is she going to? Emma couldn't finish the sentence. Not on my watch, Owen said. He stood up and began to move. The preparation was a blur of survival instinct. He took his heavy blue puffer jacket and laid it out on the table. He took the mylar blankets and wrapped them around Sophie again, then layered her in his own spare fleece. He fashioned a carrier out of his tactical webbing and the wool horse blanket, creating a secure, insulated nest on his chest. I'm going to carry Sophie, he told Emma. She'll be inside my coat. My heart will keep hers beating. You understand? My heat is her heat. He then turned to Emma. He took her small hands and wrapped them in extra socks before putting her mittens back on. He took a length of paracord from his pack and tied one end to his tactical belt and the other to her waist. This is our lifeline, he said. If I move, you move. If you fall, I'll feel it. You don't let go of this cord for anything. Not for the wind, not for the dark. You are part of my pack now. He looked at Colt. The dog was already standing by the door, his hackles raised, his amber eyes fixed on the darkness beyond the wood. Colt, you're the scout. You find the ground. You tell me where the ice is. The dog let out a low, affirmative rumble. Owen took a deep breath, the cold air from the edges of the room stinging his lungs. He felt a familiar weight settling onto his shoulders, not the weight of guilt, but the weight of a mission. It was a visceral, physical sensation. The ghost of the Amati family was there in the shadows of the cabin, but they weren't accusing him anymore. They were watching. He walked to the desk and grabbed the box of emergency flares. He tucked them into his pockets. Then he picked up the small, limp bundle that was Sophie. He tucked her against his chest, her head resting just beneath his chin. He could feel her shallow, fluttering heartbeat against his own sternum. 1-2. 1-2. Stay with me, Sophie. Are you ready, Emma? I'm scared, Owen, she whispered. Good, he said, and for the first time he gave her a real smile, a grim, determined flash of teeth. Being scared means you're paying attention. Use it. Let it keep you awake. He reached for the door handle. The metal was so cold it burned through his glove. One more thing, Owen said, pausing. When we get out there, the wind is going to try to talk to you. It's going to try to tell you to stop. It's going to tell you to lie down. Don't you listen to it. You only listen to me and Colt. We are the only things that are real tonight. He shoved the door open. The mountain didn't just meet them, it attacked. A wall of white fury slammed into the cabin, instantly extinguishing the small fire in the stove. The temperature plummeted 40 degrees in a heartbeat. The world vanished into a chaotic swirl of gray and white. Owen stepped out, his boots sinking deep into the fresh, unstable drift. Behind him, Emma let out a small gasp as the wind caught her, but the paracord snapped taut, and Owen felt her weight anchor to him. Colt. Lead. The dog leapt into the void, his dark shape instantly becoming a shadow in the mist. Owen began to walk. He didn't look back at the ranger station. He didn't look at the radio that had failed them. He kept his eyes on the phantom shape of his dog and his hand protectively over the small warm lump beneath his jacket. I promised, he thought as he stepped into the abyss. I promised them, and I'm promising you, Lily. I'm coming home. But first I'm bringing these two back to their mother. The alternate route was a narrow, jagged spine of rock known as the Devil's Tail. It was steep, exposed to the full force of the gale, and prone to slough, avalanches, small but deadly slides of top-layer snow. But it was the only way that bypassed the blocked main road. Every step was a gamble. The snow masked hidden crevices and deadfall traps of buried branches. Owen moved with a rhythmic, pounding intensity, his breath coming in clouds of silver steam. "Keep moving, Emma," he shouted over his shoulder. He could feel Sophie's head bobbing against his chest. She was unconscious now, her body entering the deep hibernation of extreme hypoxia. "Breathe for her," Owen hissed to himself, his own lungs burning as he hauled his three-person caravan through the frozen waste. "Breathe for her, you bastard. Don't you dare stop." The darkness was absolute, save for the occasional flickering beam of his headlamp. The world was reduced to the 3 feet of snow in front of him and the tug of the cord behind him. Suddenly the ground beneath Owen's feet didn't just shift, it vanished. A snow bridge over a small drainage ditch collapsed. Owen felt the sickening drop of a 3-foot fall. He twisted in midair, his primary instinct to protect the child on his chest. He slammed into the frozen ground, the wind knocked out of him in a violent spray of crystals. "Owen!" Emma screamed, the cord jerking her toward the hole. "Stay back." Owen wheezed, his hand instantly checking the bundle. Sophie was still there. She hadn't been crushed. He looked up. Above them, on the higher ridge, a sound began to grow. It wasn't the wind. It was a deep, guttural rumble that vibrated in the soles of his boots. It was the sound of a mountain losing its patience. The avalanche. The rumble deepened into a roar. Owen scrambled to his feet, his adrenaline overriding the sharp pain in his shoulder. "Emma, run. Toward the rocks. The big rocks." He grabbed the cord and hauled her toward a cluster of ancient granite boulders that stood like sentinels on the edge of the ridge. They reached the lee of the stone just as the first wave of white thunder roared past, a river of snow and ice that would have swept them into the valley like dust. They huddled against the cold stone, the world shaking around them. Owen looked down at Sophie. In the chaos of the move, her face had become exposed to the wind. He quickly tucked her back in, but as he did, he felt a terrifying stillness. He put his hand over her mouth. "Nothing." "No," Owen whispered. "No, no, no." The avalanche was still roaring 10 yards away, a waterfall of white death, and in the shadow of the rocks, Owen hardly realized the clock had finally run out. Sophie had stopped breathing. He looked at Emma, who was curled in a ball, her eyes wide with a terror that no child should ever know. He looked at Colt, who was standing over them, his teeth bared at the storm. And then Owen Hartley did something he hadn't done since the day the helicopter left him in the desert. He didn't think. He didn't calculate. He acted. He tore open his jacket, exposing himself to the sub-zero wind. He tilted Sophie's head back, his fingers finding the small, cold arc of her jaw. "Breathe, Sophie," he commanded, his voice a roar that challenged the mountain itself. He covered her mouth and nose with his own, and he gave her his air. Theme: promises to children are sacred contracts. In the middle of an avalanche, with his own life hanging by a thread, Owen Hartley was no longer a man running from death. He was a man fighting for life, one breath at a time. The world was a crushing weight of white noise and freezing pressure, but inside the small, jagged lee of the granite boulders, time had slowed to the rhythm of a dying pulse. Owen Hartley didn't feel the cold anymore. His nerve endings had surrendered to the frost, leaving him in a state of hyper-focused clarity. He was crouched in the snow, his back arched like a cathedral over the two girls, his blue puffer jacket thrown open. Beneath him, Sophie lay on the silver mylar blanket, her face a mask of pale marble. He had just given her his 4th breath. "Come on, Sophie," he hissed, his voice a jagged rasp that was barely human. "Don't you do this. Don't you leave Emma. Don't you leave me." He leaned down again. He could feel the frost on her lips, the terrifying stillness of her chest. He pinched her nose and delivered another steady, measured breath. He imagined his own life, the fire he still carried, the stubborn, angry heat of a survivor, pouring into her small, empty lungs. 1 Mississippi. 2 Mississippi. 3 Mississippi. He watched her chest. For a heartbeat, there was nothing but the scream of the wind. Then a shudder. It was a tiny, microscopic twitch of her diaphragm. Then another. Then, a sound that was more precious to Owen than any medal of valor he had ever received. A ragged, wet, desperate gasp. Sophie's eyes didn't open, but her throat moved as she swallowed air. A thin, weak wheeze returned, a sign that her airway had shifted just enough to let the world back in. "She's breathing," Emma shrieked. She was huddled against the rock, her small hands clutching the paracord that still bound her to Owen's waist. Her face was soaked with tears that had frozen into icy tracks on her cheeks. "Owen, she's breathing." "She's fighting," Owen corrected, his voice thick with a sudden, overwhelming emotion. He quickly zipped his jacket back up, tucking Sophie into the hollow of his chest, her head resting against his collarbone. "But we aren't done yet. We have to move. Now." But the mountain wasn't finished with its descent. Colt, who had been standing guard at the edge of their stone sanctuary, suddenly let out a sound Owen had only heard once before, during a night raid in the Arghandab Valley. It was a sharp staccato bark followed by a long mournful howl that vibrated in the very marrow of Owen's bones. The dog scrambled back toward them, his hackles standing like needles, his eyes fixed on the ridge above. Then came the crack. It wasn't a rumble this time. It was a sharp, explosive snap like a giant's bone breaking. The secondary avalanche, the hang fire from the first slide, had been triggered by the weight of the new snow. "Get down," Owen roared. He didn't have time to run. He grabbed Emma by the back of her coat and threw her into the deepest crevice of the granite boulders, pinning her against the stone with his own body. He tucked his head down, shielding Sophie with his chest and his arms, effectively turning himself into a human shield of Gore-Tex and muscle. The world went black. It wasn't a fall, it was a burial. The snow hit them with the force of a tidal wave, a heavy, suffocating mass of ice and grit. Owen felt the impact in his shrapnel-damaged shoulder, a white-hot flash of agony that threatened to black him out. He gritted his teeth, his fingers clawing into the cracks of the granite, anchoring himself. "Stay heavy. Stay solid. Don't let the mountain move you." The roar was deafening, a freight train passing inches from his ears. He felt the snow rising around his waist, his chest, his neck. He fought the urge to gasp, keeping his mouth shut as the fine crystalline dust filled the air. And then, as quickly as it had begun, the roar faded into a terrifying, heavy silence. Owen was buried to his shoulders. He couldn't move his legs. The weight of the snow was immense, pressing the air out of his lungs. He felt a moment of pure animal panic, the tomb effect that had claimed so many soldiers in the high passes of the Hindu Kush. "Emma?" he croaked. I'm here," a muffled voice replied from beneath his arm. She was pinned under him, protected by the overhang of the rock and the bulk of his body. "I can't breathe, Owen." "Don't panic. Just small breaths." Owen tried to shift his weight, but the snow had already begun to set, turning into something as hard as concrete. He struggled, his muscles screaming, but he was anchored in place. Then he heard the scratching. A frenetic, rhythmic digging sound. A second later, a wet nose shoved its way through the snow near Owen's ear, followed by a frantic, high-pitched whining. "Colt," Owen breathed. The dog was a blur of fur and claws. He had been on the outskirts of the slide and had avoided the brunt of it. Now his military training and his wolf ancestry took over. He dug with a ferocious, single-minded intensity, throwing plumes of snow behind him. Within minutes, he had cleared the space around Owen's head and shoulders, allowing him to heave his chest upward. Owen used his one free hand, his right, to begin digging Emma out. It was a slow, agonizing process. His fingers were numb, and every movement sent a fresh wave of pain through his injured shoulder. But he didn't stop. He couldn't. When Emma was finally free, she crawled out from under him, her eyes wide with a shock that transcended fear. She looked at the world around them. The path they had been on was gone. The boulders they had sheltered against were now half-buried islands in a sea of churned white. "We're alive," she whispered, looking at Colt, who was licking the snow from her face. "We're not home yet," Owen said. He managed to haul himself out of the drift, his legs shaking. He checked the bundle on his chest. Sophie was still there. Her heartbeat was faint, a rhythmic flutter like a dying candle, but it was there. He looked down the slope. The avalanche had cleared a path, but it was a path of destruction. It had stripped the trees and the earth bare, leaving a jagged, steep descent of ice and debris. But at the very bottom of the valley, miles away through the thinning veil of the storm, he saw something. A flash. Blue. Then red. Then blue again. "Lights," Owen rasped, pointing with a trembling hand. "Emma, look. The ambulance. They're at the lower checkpoint." The sight of those lights acted like a shot of adrenaline to his heart. It was the finish line. The extraction point. Can we make it? Emma asked, her voice small. We have to, Owen said. He looked at the paracord. It was still tied between them. I'm going to carry you both. No, Owen. You can't. You're hurt. I'm a soldier, Emma. We're made of spare parts and bad attitude. Now get on my back. Wrap your arms around my neck. Don't let go. It was an impossible feat of physical endurance. Owen Hartley, carrying a 60-pound girl on his back and a 40-pound girl on his chest, began the final descent of the Devil's Tail. His boots slipped on the ice-slicked granite. His vision blurred, the world turning into a kaleidoscope of gray shadows and white sparks. He moved in a trance, his mind retreating to a place beyond pain. He wasn't thinking about the cold. He wasn't thinking about the 5 years he'd spent in isolation. He was thinking about the Amati family. In his mind, they were walking beside him. The mother in her colorful scarf was holding Emma's hand. The two little sisters were laughing, their voices blending with the wind. They weren't ghosts of failure anymore. They were a phantom guard, pushing him forward, refusing to let him fall. 10 more steps. 10 more. Colt led the way, his body a dark beacon in the snow. The dog was exhausted, his gait heavy, but he refused to falter. Every few yards he would stop and look back, his amber eyes checking on his pack. The lights grew larger. The blue and red glow reflected off the low-hanging clouds, turning the world into a surreal, pulsing landscape. Owen could hear the distant, muffled sound of a siren, a long, mournful wail that signaled hope. The final 100 yards were a blur of screaming muscles and frozen breath. Owen reached the edge of the asphalt, the lower mountain road that had been cleared by the snowplows. He saw the vehicles. 3 SUVs with "Search and Rescue" emblazoned on the sides. 2 ambulances. A knot of people in bright orange parkas huddled around a portable heater. Owen didn't shout. He didn't have the air left in his lungs. He simply stumbled onto the road, his boots clattering on the blacktop. "Hey!" a voice cried out. A flashlight beam hit him, blindingly bright. "Over here. I got movement. Someone's coming off the ridge." Owen kept walking. He didn't stop until he reached the first ambulance. He saw the doors swing open, saw the medics jumping out with their bags and their blankets. But then he saw the 2 figures standing by the lead SUV. A man and a woman. They were huddled together, their faces etched with a grief so profound it looked like a physical wound. The woman, Rachel Collins, was clutching a child-stuffed rabbit to her chest. She saw him first. She didn't move at first. She just stared, her mouth falling open. She looked at the massive snow-covered man stumbling toward her, at the dog by his side, and at the bundle tucked into his jacket. "Emma?" she whispered. "Mommy?" Emma shrieked. She slid off Owen's back, her legs buckling as she hit the pavement. She scrambled toward her parents, her silver mylar blanket flapping behind her like a cape. "Emma! Oh God, Emma!" Rachel fell to her knees, scooping her daughter into her arms. Daniel Collins was there a second later, his arms wrapping around both of them, his body shaking with a sob that sounded like a tectonic plate shifting. Owen stood 5 feet away, his chest heaving, his legs vibrating with the effort of staying upright. He reached into his jacket and carefully, tenderly unhooked the webbing. A medic, a young man with wide, shocked eyes, rushed forward. "Sir, give her to me. Let me take her." Owen shook his head. He didn't let go until he reached the parents. "She needs the inhaler," Owen rasped, his voice a ghost of itself. "Acute asthma. Hypothermic. She stopped breathing 10 minutes ago. I gave her 5 breaths." He handed the small, limp bundle of Sophie to her father. Daniel Collins took his daughter, his hands trembling. He looked down at her pale, still face, then back at Owen. There were no words in the English language for what was in the man's eyes. It was a debt that could never be repaid, a gratitude that was too large for a human heart. "Go," Owen whispered. "Get her in the ambulance." The medics swarmed. They took Sophie, whisking her into the back of the vehicle. Rachel followed, her hand never leaving Emma's shoulder. The doors slammed shut, and the ambulance roared to life, its tires screaming as it sped toward the hospital in the valley. Owen stood alone in the middle of the road. The adrenaline was gone. The mission was over. The weight of the mountain, the war, and the 5 years of guilt finally crashed down on him. His knees hit the pavement first, then his hands. He leaned forward, his forehead pressing against the cold, wet asphalt. He didn't cry because he was hurt. He didn't cry because he was cold. He cried because, for the first time since he had stepped off that helicopter in the desert, he didn't feel like a ghost. He felt the warmth of a tongue against his ear. Colt was there, leaning his heavy, tired body against Owen's side. The dog let out a soft whine, his tail thumping once, weakly, against Owen's leg. Mission accomplished, partner. Owen Hartley, the man who had died in Afghanistan, stayed on the ground for a long time. But as the sun began to bleed a pale, watery light over the eastern ridge, he finally looked up. He looked at his hands. They were scarred, frostbitten, and shaking. But they were the hands that had brought 2 children back from the dead. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. It was cracked, the screen a spiderweb of glass. But it still turned on. He looked at the voicemail from Lily. "Hey Lily," he whispered into the dark, his voice breaking. "It's Dad. I'm coming home. I've got a lot to tell you. And I think I'm ready to be a protector again." The mountain was silent now, the storm spent. And as the rescue workers moved toward him with blankets and hot coffee, Owen Hartley finally stopped running. Theme: redemption comes in the moment you stop running from failure. Owen had saved the girls, and in doing so, he had saved the man he thought he'd lost forever. The transition from the interior of the ranger station to the open throat of the mountain was like stepping through a portal into a violent, prehistoric world. The heavy oak door slammed shut behind them with a finality that felt like a tomb closing, leaving the 3 of them, a broken soldier, an 8-year-old girl, and a war dog, at the mercy of a wilderness that had long ago forgotten the concept of mercy. Owen Hartley didn't hesitate. He couldn't afford to. He knew that the moment they stopped moving, the thermal debt of their bodies would begin to bank toward bankruptcy. "Stay close, Emma," he shouted, his voice instantly snatched away by the gale. "Hold on to my belt. Don't let go for anything. Not if you slip, not if you're scared. You hold on like your life depends on it, because it does." Owen had fashioned a makeshift carrier for Sophie with a level of ingenuity born of battlefield desperation. Using his tactical webbing, the heavy wool horse blanket, and the last of the paracord, he had strapped the 6-year-old to his back. He had wrapped her in the silver mylar blanket first, creating a reflective core, then layered her in his own spare fleece. She was a silent, heavy weight against his spine, her head tucked into the crook of his neck that he could feel the faint, shallow warmth of her breath against the skin of his throat, a rhythmic, fragile reminder of why he was still standing. To protect Emma, he had performed a final act of self-sacrifice. He had taken off his heavy blue puffer jacket and wrapped it around her. It was 3 sizes too big, hanging down to her knees like a suit of sapphire armor, but it carried his body heat and the residual warmth of the cabin. Owen now stood in only a thick thermal base layer and a windproof fleece, a dangerous gambit but a calculated one. As long as he was moving, his muscles would generate heat. If he stopped, he was a dead man. Colt. Lead. The German shepherd moved into the abyss. The dog's dark coat was instantly plastered with white, turning him into a phantom shape that flickered in and out of the beam of Owen's headlamp. Colt didn't just walk, he tested. He would step forward, his paws sinking deep, and pause for a microsecond to feel the vibration of the snowpack before signaling Owen to follow. They began the descent of the Devil's Tail. The terrain was a nightmare of verticality and instability. The path was a jagged spine of rock that dropped off into nothingness on both sides. In the pitch black of the blizzard, the world was reduced to a 5-foot circle of gray light. Beyond that circle lay the void. The snow was falling so hard now it felt like liquid static, clogging Owen's eyelashes and filling his mouth every time he tried to breathe. Each step was a monumental effort of will. Owen had to lift his knees high to clear the drifts, all while balancing the weight of Sophie on his back and the steady rhythmic tug of Emma behind him. His left shoulder, the one riddled with Afghan shrapnel, began to scream. It wasn't a dull ache, it was a white-hot electric fire that radiated down to his fingertips. 1 step, 2 steps, dig in, pull. Owen? The voice was tiny, almost swallowed by the roar of the wind. Owen stopped, leaning his weight forward against a gust that threatened to upend the entire caravan. He turned his head slightly. Emma was a small blue shadow behind him, her hands white-knuckled as she gripped his tactical belt. "I'm here, Emma. Talk to me. Is Sophie going to die?" The question was raw, stripped of the layers of protection that adults usually provide for children. Out here, in the heart of the storm, there was no room for euphemism. The cold had a way of demanding the truth. Owen looked up at the sky, though there was no sky to see, only a churning ceiling of gray ice. He thought of the Ahmadi girls. He thought of the way the smoke had looked against the desert horizon. He thought of the 5 years he had spent believing that he was a man who brought death with him wherever he went. "Not on my watch," Owen said. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried a resonance that seemed to cut through the wind. He reached back and patted Emma's frozen hand. "Do you hear me?" Not on my watch. How do you know? She sobbed, her body shaking with a fatigue that was reaching its breaking point. It's so cold. I can't feel my feet anymore. Owen knelt down, a move that cost him a groan of agony from his knees. He pulled Emma closer, shielding her from the wind with his own torso. Listen to me, Emma. I knew some guys once. Navy SEALs. They were the toughest men I ever met. They used to have a saying when things got as bad as they could possibly get. They'd look at each other and say, "The only easy day was yesterday." Emma blinked through her frozen lashes. What does that mean? It means that today is hard. And tomorrow might be harder. But as long as you're moving, you're winning. It means that strength isn't about having big muscles or not being scared. True strength is carrying the people who can't carry themselves. I'm carrying Sophie. I'm carrying the memories of people I couldn't save. And you? You're carrying the hope for your whole family. You're the bravest soldier I've ever served with. He looked at her, his steel gray eyes locking onto hers. We are the protectors, Emma. And protectors don't quit until the mission is over. Can you give me another mile? Emma took a shuddering breath. She looked at the bundle on Owen's back, her sister, her heart, and then she looked back at Owen. She nodded, a sharp, jerky movement. The only easy day was yesterday, she whispered. That's my girl. Now stand up. Stay on my belt. They pushed on. The wind shifted, coming at them from the side now, a lateral force that tried to shove them off the ridge. Owen leaned into it, his boots grinding against the hidden ice. He felt like an ancient pack animal, a beast of burden fueled by a strange, cold fire. The physical toll was becoming visceral. Owen's heart was hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird, and his lungs felt like they were being lined with frost. He started to hallucinate. He saw the orange glow of a desert sunset on the edge of his vision. He heard the rhythmic thud-thud-thud of a helicopter that wasn't there. Stay in the present, Hartley, he snarled at himself. The past is dead. These girls are alive. He checked on Sophie. He reached back, his hand fumbling over the mylar blanket until he felt the side of her neck. She was drifting. Her pulse was a thready, fluttering thing like the heartbeat of a sparrow. She didn't stir when he touched her. Sophie, he whispered. Stay with us. We're almost there. I can feel the valley. I can feel the bottom. It was a lie, but it was a necessary one. They were still at least 2 miles from the lower road, and the hardest part of the Devil's Tail, the crush zone, where the slope exceeded 45 degrees, was still ahead of them. The snow was now knee-deep. Every step required Owen to haul his entire body weight upward and forward. He felt the paracord at his waist jerk. Emma had slipped. He spun around, catching her before she could slide into the darkness. She was face down in the snow, her breath coming in panicked gasps. I can't, she wailed. Owen, I can't do it. My legs won't move. Owen didn't give her a pep talk this time. He didn't have the breath for it. He simply reached down, grabbed her by the scruff of the jacket, and hauled her back to her feet. He pulled her into his chest, letting her feel the heat radiating from his core. You can, he said, his voice a low, vibrating growl. You're a Collins. And Collinses don't stay down. Look at Colt. The dog had stopped 10 feet ahead. He was looking back at them, his ears pricked, his tail low and steady. He wasn't barking. He was waiting. He believes in you, Emma. I believe in you. Now move. They continued the descent. The terrain began to change. The jagged rock gave way to a steep, forested slope, the deadfall forest. Here, the danger wasn't a cliff edge. It was the buried trunks of fallen trees that created hidden pits in the snow. If one of them broke a leg here, the story was over. Colt was moving with extreme caution now. He would sniff the snow, circle a spot, and then bark once to indicate a safe path. Suddenly, Colt froze. It wasn't a pause to check the ground. It was a total muscular lockdown. The dog's ears went flat against his skull, and a low, vibrating snarl started deep in his chest, a sound of pure ancestral warning. Owen stopped instantly, his hand dropping to the heavy flashlight at his belt. He swept the beam in a wide arc. What is it, boy? The light hit the trees 20 yards to their left. At first, there was nothing but the chaotic dance of snowflakes. Then Owen saw them. 2 eyes. Amber gold, reflecting the light with a cold, predatory intensity. Then another pair. And another. A wolf pack. In a normal winter, the wolves of the Blue Ridge were ghosts, avoiding humans at all costs. But this wasn't a normal winter. The blizzard had driven the deer into the deep valleys, and the predators were hungry, desperate, and territorial. To them, a stumbling man and 2 small, shivering children looked like a final meal before the freeze. Emma let out a whimpering cry, clutching Owen's belt so hard her fingers cramped. "Owen, what are they?" "Stay behind me, Emma," Owen said, his voice turning into the steel-cold tone of a man who had faced down insurgents in the dark. He didn't pull a weapon. He didn't have one. He had his flashlight, his dog, and his will. Colt stepped forward, his hackles rising until he looked twice his actual size. He let out a bark that wasn't a warning, it was a challenge. It was the sound of a war dog telling the mountain that he had a mission, and anything in his way was going to have to bleed for it. Owen clicked his flashlight to its highest strobe setting. The light began to pulse with a violent, disorienting frequency. He stepped forward, putting himself between the girls and the eyes in the dark. "Get back!" he roared, a sound that came from the very bottom of his soul. It was a primal, territorial shout, the voice of a guardian who had finally accepted his role. The eyes flickered. The lead wolf, a massive gray beast with a scarred muzzle, hesitated. It looked at the pulsing light, then at the snarling German shepherd, and finally at the man who looked like he was made of stone and shadow. With a low, submissive whine, the lead wolf turned. The pack followed, vanishing into the whiteout like smoke. Owen stood there for a long moment, his chest heaving, his hands shaking. He looked down at Emma. She was staring at him with an expression of pure, unadulterated awe. "You scared them away," she whispered. "No," Owen said, his voice finally breaking. "We did. They saw the pack, Emma. They saw that we weren't going to let each other go." He looked at Colt. The dog trotted back to him, nudging Owen's hand with his wet nose. "Good boy," Owen whispered. The theme of the night was carved into the ice under their feet. True strength is carrying those who can't carry themselves. Owen felt the weight of Sophie on his back, and he realized it wasn't a burden. It was an anchor. It was the very thing keeping him from being blown away by the wind. He adjusted the webbing, feeling the warmth of the girl's body against his. "We're close now, Emma," he said, and this time he wasn't lying. He could smell the ozone of the valley floor. He could feel the thinning of the air. The only easy day was yesterday. And today? Today is the day we make it home. They stepped back into the march. The snow was still falling and the wind was still screaming, but the darkness no longer felt like an enemy. It felt like a witness. Owen Hartley, carrying the future on his back and the present by his side, moved down the devil's tail. He wasn't a ghost anymore. He was a man with a name, a dog, and a daughter waiting for him in the valley. And the mountain, for the first time in 100 years, stepped aside to let him through. The air at the base of the devil's tail was a pressurized soup of ice crystals and ozone. It was nearly midnight, the hour where the mountain usually claimed its final tithe of the day, and Owen Hartley could feel the atmospheric weight pressing against his eardrums. Every breath was a conscious choice, a jagged pull of sub-zero oxygen that felt like drawing a blade across his throat. He was beyond exhaustion. He was operating in the red zone, that hallucinatory space where the body systems begin to shut down and the mind retreats into a singular, primal directive. Keep moving. He felt Sophie's weight on his back, a small, cooling anchor, and the steady, rhythmic tug of Emma's hand on his belt. They were less than half a mile from the valley floor, where the treeline thickened into a protective barrier of ancient spruce. If they could reach the timber, the wind would lose its teeth. But the mountain had one last card to play. Colt, who had been moving with the steady, rhythmic gait of a wolf, suddenly stopped. He didn't just pause. He locked his joints, his tail dropping, his ears swiveling toward the heights they had just descended. A low, vibrating snarl started in his chest, a sound so deep it seemed to resonate in the soles of Owen's boots. "What is it, boy?" Owen rasped, his voice a ghost of itself. Then he heard it. It wasn't the scream of the wind. It was a sound he had heard in the Arghandab Valley, the sound of a hillside losing its grip on reality. A sharp, explosive crack, the sound of a 2-foot-thick layer of hoarfrost failing under the weight of the new snow. It was a dry, hollow boom that signaled the start of a secondary avalanche. Owen looked up. Through the churning whiteout, a wall of gray-white shadow was descending. It wasn't a roar yet. It was a hiss, a billion tiny ice particles sliding over one another, gathering mass and velocity with every millisecond. "Down. Cover your heads." Owen screamed. There was no time to run. There was no rock to hide behind. They were on an exposed flank of the ridge, a blank canvas of ice. Owen acted on instinct, his military training taking over the moment his conscious mind began to panic. He grabbed Emma by the scruff of her oversized jacket and yanked her toward him, slamming her down into the snow. He threw himself over both girls, his massive frame acting as a biological shield. He tucked Sophie into the hollow created by his chest and the ground, and pinned Emma beneath his shoulder. He dug his boots into the crust, his fingers clawing at the frozen earth beneath the drifts. "Hold your breath," he roared. Then the world turned white. It didn't feel like snow. It felt like being hit by a freight train made of wet concrete. The force was immense, a crushing physical weight that shoved the air out of Owen's lungs. He felt his shrapnel-damaged shoulder buckle under the pressure, a white-hot flash of agony that blinded him. He felt the snow filling his ears, his collar, his mouth. He didn't let go. Even as the pressure mounted, even as he felt the girls struggling beneath him, he stayed solid. He was a mountain of Gore-Tex and bone, refusing to be moved. Then came the silence. The roar vanished, replaced by a terrifying, absolute stillness. The white tomb. Owen was buried. He couldn't move his arms. He couldn't feel his legs. The snow had set instantly, the friction of the slide creating heat that immediately refroze into a solid block of ice. "Stay calm," he told himself, his heart thundering against his ribs like a trapped bird. "Don't use up the oxygen. Don't panic." In the darkness, the ghosts returned. He saw the Amati girls again. They were standing in the desert sun, their colorful scarves fluttering. But this time they weren't turning away. They were reaching out. "Save them, Owen," they seemed to whisper. "Don't let the snow be the end of the story." Beside him, he felt a small movement. Emma was pinned beneath his arm, her small face pressed into the crook of his elbow where a tiny pocket of air remained. She let out a muffled, terrified whimper. "I'm here, Emma," Owen tried to say, but his mouth was full of snow. He spat it out, his chest heaving against the weight of the drift. "I'm here." Suddenly, the silence was broken by a frantic, rhythmic scratching sound from above. It was followed by a sharp, staccato bark, the sound of a partner who refused to leave a man behind. Cole. The dog had been on the edge of the slide, his natural agility allowing him to ride the crest of the wave. Now he was digging. Owen could feel the vibrations of the dog's paws, the frantic energy of a war dog on a recovery mission. A second later, a beam of light, the filtered, pale glow of the moon or perhaps the storm, pierced the white. A wet nose shoved through the snow near Owen's ear, followed by the hot, metallic breath of the shepherd. Cole dug like a machine. Within seconds, Owen's head and right shoulder were free. He let out a long, ragged gasp of air, the coldness of it feeling like a miracle. "Good boy," Owen wheezed. "Good boy." He used his free hand to claw at the snow, clearing the space around Emma and Sophie. He hauled them out of the drift, his muscles screaming in protest. They emerged like ghosts, covered in white dust, shaking so violently they could barely stand. Emma looked around, her eyes wide with a shock that transcended fear. "Is it over?" "It's over," Owen said, his voice cracking. He looked down the slope. The avalanche had cleared a path, stripping the mountain down to the bone. And there, at the very bottom of the ridge, he saw it. Lights. They weren't the pale, deceptive lights of a hallucination. They were the sharp, blue and red strobes of emergency vehicles. They were the golden beams of heavy-duty flashlights cutting through the mist. "Look," Owen whispered, pointing a trembling hand toward the valley floor. "Mommy?" Emma gasped. "We're going down," Owen said. He didn't have the strength to walk normally. He scooped Emma up in his right arm and kept Sophie tucked against his chest with his left. He was carrying nearly 100 pounds of child, his body a shattered wreck of its former self, but he moved with a pounding, relentless momentum. He stumbled down the final slope, his boots sliding on the debris. He fell once, twice, but he never let the girls hit the ground. He was a creature of pure will, a guardian who had finally found his purpose at the end of the world. As he reached the edge of the asphalt, the lower mountain road, the world suddenly became crowded. "Over here," a voice shouted. "I've got movement on the ridge." Flashlights hit him, blindingly bright. Owen didn't stop. He kept walking until he reached the center of the road, his breath coming in silver plumes. A man and a woman broke from the crowd of searchers. They were running through the slush, their faces etched with a grief that was being rewritten in real time into something raw and holy. "Emma." "Sophie." It was a cry that came from the very center of a mother's soul. Rachel Collins fell to her knees in the middle of the road, her arms outstretched. Daniel Collins was right behind her, his face soaked with tears. Owen reached them. He let Emma slide to the ground, and she collapsed into her mother's arms with a sob that broke the silence of the night. "Mommy? Mommy?" Owen knelt down, his joints popping, and carefully handed the small, limp bundle of Sophie to her father. She's alive," Owen rasped. "She needs oxygen. Asthma attack, hypothermia. I gave her breaths." Daniel Collins took his daughter, his hands shaking so hard he almost dropped her. He looked at the veteran, his eyes wide with a gratitude so deep it was terrifying. "Thank you. Oh God, thank you." Paramedics swarmed them. They whisked Sophie into the back of an ambulance, the blue lights reflecting off the silver mylar blankets. Rachel followed, her hand never leaving Emma's shoulder. The doors slammed, and the ambulance roared to life, its siren a long triumphant wail that echoed through the valley. Owen stood there, alone in the middle of the road. The adrenaline that had been keeping him upright evaporated, leaving him hollow. The cold finally found its way into his marrow. His knees hit the blacktop and he leaned forward, his forehead pressing against the wet, salted asphalt. He felt a hand on his face. He looked up. Rachel Collins had come back. She was kneeling in the slush in front of him, her eyes fixed on his. She didn't say a word at first. She simply reached out and grabbed his face with her gloved hands, her thumb wiping a smear of blood from his cheek. "You brought them back," she whispered, her voice a ragged, beautiful thing. "You brought my babies back from the dark." And in that moment, the wall that Owen Hartley had built around his heart 5 years ago, the wall of guilt, the wall of Afghanistan, the wall of failure, finally crumbled. He didn't just cry. He broke. He leaned forward, his head dropping onto Rachel's shoulder, and let out a guttural, soul-shaking sob. It was the sound of a man finally setting down a burden he had carried for too long. He cried for the Ahmadi family. He cried for the 5 years he'd spent hiding from his own daughter. He cried for the man he used to be and the man he had just become. Rachel held him, her arms wrapped around his broad, shaking shoulders, while Colt moved in and pressed his heavy body against Owen's side. The dog let out a soft, morning whine, his tail thumping once against the road. The theme of the night was written in the melting snow at their feet. Redemption comes in the moment you stop running from failure. Owen Hartley had spent years running from the ghosts of the children he couldn't save. He had sought the silence of the mountains to drown out the noise of his own guilt. But the mountain hadn't given him silence. It had given him a mission. It had given him 2 girls who needed a protector, and in saving them, he had finally saved himself. "It's okay," Rachel whispered, her own tears falling onto his neck. "It's over now. You did it." Owen pulled back, his face wet, his steel-gray eyes finally clear. He looked at the ambulance disappearing into the distance, then at the dog who had never doubted him. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his cracked, frozen phone. He looked at the number he hadn't dialed in months. "I'm going home," he whispered to the night. "Colt, we're going home." As the sun began to cast its first pale light over the Blue Ridge peaks, Owen Hartley stood up. He was a man with a scarred shoulder and a broken past, but as he walked toward his truck with his dog by his side, he finally knew who he was. He was a guardian. He was a father. And he was finally truly back from the war. The smell of the Asheville Veterans Hospital was a world away from the ozone and ice of the Blue Ridge peaks. Here the air was heavy with the scent of industrial floor wax, sterile latex, and the lukewarm steam of cafeteria coffee. It was a stagnant warmth, the kind that didn't require a man to fight for every breath, but Owen Hartley found himself pacing the hallway nonetheless. His boots, now polished and salt-free, made a rhythmic heavy sound on the linoleum. Every few steps, his left shoulder would hitch, a dull, throbbing reminder of the night he had turned his body into a shield against a mountain of falling snow. The doctors called it a grade 3 separation, aggravated by severe frostbite and physical exhaustion. Owen just called it the price of admission. He stopped in front of room 412. Through the glass, he could see the afternoon sun spilling across the bedsheets in a soft, honey-colored glow. "You going in, or you just planning on wearing a hole in the floor?" Owen turned to see Rachel Collins standing behind him. She looked different than the ghost-white woman he had met in the middle of a midnight blizzard. Her hair was pulled back in a neat ponytail, and the hollow shadows beneath her eyes had begun to fill with the light of a woman who had seen the impossible come true. "Just catching my breath," Owen lied, his voice still carrying a hint of the gravelly rasp from the storm. "You've been catching your breath for 3 weeks, Owen," Rachel said, stepping forward and placing a hand on his arm. Her touch was warm and steady. "She's been asking for you every hour. And if you don't go in there soon, Emma is going to come out here and drag you in by your belt." Owen smiled, a real, genuine expression that didn't feel like a mask. He pushed the door open. The room was an explosion of color. Stuffed animals of every genus and species crowded the windowsill, and the walls were papered with get-well cards from half the county. But the center of the room was Sophie. She was sitting up in bed, a small plastic mask around her neck and a coloring book in her lap. Her cheeks were no longer the color of wood ash. They were a bright, healthy pink. Owen. It was Emma who reached him first. The 8-year-old was a blur of navy blue fleece as she collided with his waist, her arms wrapping around him in a crushing hug. Owen winced slightly as she hit his bad shoulder, but he didn't pull away. He rested his large, scarred hand on the back of her head. "Hey, little soldier," he whispered. "I made you something," Emma said, pulling back and thrusting a piece of construction paper toward him. It was a drawing rendered in the bold, frantic strokes of a child's crayon. It depicted a giant man in a blue jacket carrying a smaller girl on his chest, while a massive black and tan dog led them through a forest of white zigzags. In the corner, a golden sun was rising. "This is you and Colt," Emma explained, her voice solemn. "Saving us from the big white." Owen stared at the drawing. He looked at the way Emma had drawn his eyes, not as the steel-gray pits of a haunted man, but as bright, protective stars. He folded the paper carefully and tucked it into his inner pocket, right over his heart. "I'll keep it forever," Owen promised. He walked to the side of the bed. Sophie looked up from her coloring book, her blue eyes wide and clear. She reached out a small hand, her fingers tracing the faded white scars on Owen's knuckles, the permanent souvenirs of his desperate scramble through the ice. "Mommy says you're our angel," Sophie whispered. "She says the mountain tried to keep us, but you wouldn't let it." Owen sat on the edge of the bed, the plastic mattress creaking. "I'm no angel, Sophie. I'm just a man with a very good dog." As if on cue, the door nudged open and Colt trotted in. The hospital had made a special exception for the hero dog, and the staff now greeted the German shepherd with more enthusiasm than the chief of surgery. Colt didn't go for the treats or the attention. He went straight to the bed, resting his heavy chin on Sophie's lap. He let out a long, contented sigh as she began to scratch behind his ears. Daniel Collins stepped into the room, carrying a tray of coffees. He set them down and walked over to Owen, extending a hand. The handshake was brief but carried the weight of a blood covenant. "The doctors say she's coming home tomorrow," Daniel said, his voice thick. "Full recovery. No permanent lung damage." "That's the best news I've heard in 5 years," Owen replied. "Owen, listen," Daniel continued, looking toward his wife. "We've talked about this. There's no way we can ever repay what you did. You gave us our lives back. But we want you to know, you're family now. Not just a friend. Not just the guy who found them. You're a part of us. Our home is yours. Always." Owen looked at the family, the 2 girls laughing at the dog, the parents standing hand in hand. For the first time, the memory of the Ahmadi family in Afghanistan didn't feel like a jagged shard of glass in his mind. It felt like a soft, distant echo. He hadn't changed the past, but he had finally balanced the scale. "Thank you," Owen said. "I think I'd like that." Later that evening, Owen sat in the cab of his truck in the hospital parking lot. The sun was dipping behind the peaks, painting the sky in bruised purples and burnt oranges. He picked up his phone. The screen was still cracked, a spiderweb of glass that made it hard to see the icons, but the dialer still worked. He scrolled to a contact he hadn't touched in months. Lily. He hit the call button before he could talk himself out of it. It rang 3 times. He was about to hang up when a voice answered, a soft, hesitant, "Hello?" Owen closed his eyes. "Hey Lily. It's Dad." There was a long silence on the other end of the line. Owen could hear the sound of a television in the background, the normal, mundane noises of a life he had abandoned. "Dad." Lily's voice was small, guarded. "Are you okay? We saw the news about the girls in the mountains. They said a veteran saved them." "I'm okay, Lily," Owen said, and for the first time he meant it. "I'm calling because I wanted to say I'm sorry. I'm sorry I've been gone. I'm sorry I didn't answer the calls. I thought staying away was a way to keep you safe from the parts of me that were broken." "I didn't want you to keep me safe, Dad," Lily said, her voice cracking. "I just wanted you to be there." Owen felt a tear track through the dust on his cheek. "I know, and I was wrong. I'm not going anywhere else. I'm still a little banged up, but I'd really like to see you. Can I come down this weekend? Or maybe you could come up here." "I want to see Colt," she said, a small laugh breaking through her sniffle. "And I want to see you. I'll be there, Lily. I promise. And this time, it's a promise I'm going to keep." 3 months later, the Blue Ridge Mountains were shedding their winter coats. The white fury of the blizzards had melted into a vibrant, emerald-green spring. The Devil's Tail was no longer a spine of ice. It was a trail lined with trillium and wild rhododendron. Owen stood at the trailhead of mile marker 52, wearing a bright orange vest with a new patch on the shoulder, a silhouette of a German shepherd's head surrounded by the words Colt's Mountain Watch. Behind him, a group of local teenagers and their parents were gathered. Among them were Emma and Sophie, looking sturdy and bright-eyed in their hiking boots. "All right, listen up," Owen called out, his voice projecting with the easy authority of a man who had found his command again. "The mountain is beautiful, but it's indifferent. It doesn't care if you're prepared or if you're scared. That's why we look out for each other. Rule number 1, never hike alone. Rule number 2, always carry your whistle and your space blanket." He looked down at the girl standing beside him. Lily, now 10, was wearing a matching orange vest. She held Colt's leash with a practiced, confident grip. She looked up at her father with a pride that made Owen's chest feel like it was going to burst. "Ready to show them the signaling drill, Lily?" "Ready, Dad." As the group began to move up the trail, Owen watched the children running ahead. Emma and Sophie were teaching Lily about Mr. Whiskers and the night they spent in the magic silver blankets. Their laughter echoed through the trees, a bright silver sound that seemed to chase away the last of the winter shadows. Owen stood for a moment looking at the summit. He could still see the spot where the avalanche had hit, a scar of fallen timber that would take decades to heal. Healing isn't erasing the past, Owen thought. It's building a future worth the pain you survived. He felt a nudge at his hand. Colt was looking up at him, his amber eyes reflecting the morning sun. Owen knelt and ruffled the dog's fur, feeling the steady, powerful heartbeat of his partner. "I thought my mission ended when I came home from the war," Owen's voice echoed in his own mind, a silent narration to the scene before him. "I thought I was just a ghost haunting a ridge. But I was wrong. Some missions never end. They just find new faces to save, new reasons to keep showing up. And sometimes, the people you save end up saving you right back." The final visual was one of peace. The sun crested the ridge, bathing the mountain in a golden light that made the dew-covered leaves shimmer like diamonds. Owen, Lily, and Colt moved up the trail together, their silhouettes merging into the landscape, no longer survivors of a storm but guardians of the heights. The mountain was no longer a place to hide. It was a place to live. And as the sound of children's laughter drifted down through the spruce trees, the Blue Ridge stood silent and beautiful, a witness to a promise kept. Sophie and Emma were minutes away from becoming a memory in the snow. They were saved by a man who had nothing left to give, yet gave everything. We spend hours crafting these stories to remind the world that there is still hope, but we can't reach the people who need this message without your help. If you're thankful those girls made it home, show it. Subscribe now and hit the like button. Don't let the algorithm hide stories of hope. Tell us in the comments, what was the most emotional part for you? Silence helps nobody, your engagement saves this channel.